Okay. This interview is part of the History Heard project. The content of this interview may be used for historical research. However, no part of the video itself may be reproduced without the express written permission of an authorized representative of History Heard. Today is June 25th, 2009 at 11 a.m. This is an interview with Robert Kahn in Washington, D.C. He was born on December 23rd, 1938 in Brooklyn, New York. Everyone wants to make a difference in the world and things like that, but very, very few actually do. And so you get to sit back and when you think about your life, you get to think about the fact that you made a huge difference with the internet and ARPANET in the beginning, and then, but, so what does that feel like?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that everybody wants to make a change in the world. But for many people, probably an accurate statement. On the other hand, life is pretty fleeting. I mean, not too many people live beyond about 100. That seems like probably a long time away for you guys, but things change. I mean, if you think about businesses, you know how many businesses that exist in America today were around 200 years ago?
Yeah.
It's probably, you can count them on the fingers of both hands or twice that number. Or even 100 years ago. There aren't that many, maybe 100, a few hundred. I mean, it's not like tens of thousands.
Right.
And so things come and things go. And I'm sure that most technologies will have a finite lifetime. And so the internet could be around, well, it's been around now for 40 years roughly. So it might be around for 100 years. I mean, maybe we've established something that really has real longevity. I mean, if I were to characterize it, I would say it's, on the internet side, the ability to link together computer networks.
Right.
So
at least the basis for something that has really long.
That basic notion might exist. I mean, in the original internet, we had 3 nets: the ARPANET, packet radio, packet satellite net. None of them exist anymore. So the nets have gone. But it's like that proverbial axe, the head, the hammer. You keep changing the axe head, and the hammer, is it still the same axe 100 years later? That part of it conceivably could exist. Whether people will be able to attribute it properly, I don't know. I mean, even today, there's so many people that have contributed to different parts of the internet that it's hard to really properly give credit. I mean, if you look at just something simple like the ARPANET, which put the notion of packet switching on the map and sort of gave people the opportunity to experiment with computer-to-computer protocols. Very few people really have a good understanding of the history of that. I mean, there are people like Licklider, who you've probably heard the name. He talked a lot about sort of the benefits of networking, but he was more of an experimental psychologist. There was a fellow named Donald Davies in the UK, worked at the National Physical Laboratory. And Donald was one of the early visionaries and actually tried to build a packet net in England, couldn't raise the money. Then there were 2 people who wrote about networking very early on in the U.S. One was a fellow named Len Kleinrock, who's now a professor at UCLA, and who did a PhD thesis on queuing networks.
We're going to be interviewing him, actually.
Okay. Len is one of the real pioneers in the field.
Yeah.
And he's contributed a lot to the analysis of networking, put out a lot of PhD students. And another one is Paul Barron, who worked at the RAND Corporation, and Paul wrote a lot about networks from the point of view of kind of communication in a nuclear environment. But they were early writers about the subject. Len's thesis is often cited as one of the early works in the area. And Paul wrote something like a 10 or 12 or 13 volume series on networking at the RAND Corporation. But it was really the work of DARPA that built the very first net and reduced it to practice. And for that, I would credit one fellow, Larry Roberts, who ran the office. That office enabled him to make this happen. The person who ran the office that hired him was a fellow named Bob Taylor, and the fellow who ran the agency was a fellow named Charlie Hertzfeld. Charlie's local, Bob is in California. But they hired Larry in to go see if he could make packet switch networking a reality. But unfortunately, that office, which I later ran myself, is a funding office, and it's more government bureaucracy than it is hardcore technical work. And so they needed somebody to be able to do the work. They wrote the RFP, and we bid on it and actually built it. So I think the actual reduction to practice of the technology was work that we did at BB&N. Now, I wasn't there alone. You know, I was a MIT professor on leave, and we had a team of people from Lincoln Laboratory who were used to building things. And so I worked with them to actually do the building of it. There's a book that Katie Hefner wrote called Where Wizards Stay Up Late that talks about that experience. And she tends to characterize me in that as an abstract theoretician, when in fact I was as deep into the design and implementation and testing of that as anybody. I mean, I didn't write the software and I didn't build the hardware, but I was sort of orchestrating a lot of that within that group. So that's an interesting book I would commend to you. It's a good read. Not entirely 100% accurate, but a good read. And then, you know, the internet, of course, was something that came about by virtue of my interaction with it. I had been working on the idea of turning computers into communication devices when I was at BB&N. And the fellow who invented the Ethernet, a fellow named Bob Metcalf, did a PhD thesis at Harvard, and in it he cited the work I had done at BB&N on that topic, which is what I took to ARPA with me when I left, and that became the basis for the internet architecture. So I pretty much had that in my head, but I needed somebody to work with me on it because I wasn't in a position to be doing any of the actual implementation work at DARPA. So that's why I asked Dr. Cerf to work with me. He had just joined the faculty at Stanford, and he had been involved in the design of the original protocols for the ARPANET, which weren't really applicable in the internet world. And so between the two of us, we took the architectural ideas that I had, you know, originally espoused, and which I think there's a paper that Barry Liner wrote you could find on the net about a short history of the internet, kind of goes into that. And Vint and I took that architectural notion and really made it much better. I mean, we improved it, and that essentially became the genesis of what happened.
Yeah, wow. And so former Vice President Al Gore was often misquoted as saying that he invented the internet. Or
actually, he never said that. He said something like he took the initiative in helping to create it, or something like that.
Misquoted often, and
for political reasons.
Right. But you and Dr. Cerf are some of the unlikely people to stand up for him and defend that he was a part of helping, but he didn't invent the internet, but he took the initiative.
Well, I mean, he knew what he did. He did what he didn't do, and I mean, I was very supportive of Al Gore in his effort to try and articulate to the world what the benefit of computer networking was. I mean, his dad, remember, was the one that took the lead in getting the bills through Congress for the super highways system in the United States. And he saw all the fiber optic links being a superhighway system of a different kind. So I'm sure that played into his thinking at some level. But he, and Vint and I wrote a little paper on that around the time of the 2000 election campaign, basically trying to state what the contribution of Al Gore was. And I think we stated in that paper that he was the first elected politician to really appreciate the value of it and articulate it. And as a result of that, it helped to raise money for it. He was a champion of it. He talked about all the possible benefits of it. And to that extent, I really think it really helped to publicize it. I mean, little startup businesses succeed, I've learned, not because you necessarily have just a good idea, but because you know how to market it. And he was sort of marketing this par excellence, but he understood. I really think he understood the benefit of it, and therefore he deserved a lot of credit. And so when he made that comment, I actually got a call from some folks on Air Force One, I think, at the time, to alert me that this had happened. And I was sitting at a board meeting out in California, just to put me on alert that I might get calls from the press. And I did. I probably got more than 100. And they all had basically the same question. You know, was I angry? And I said, you got to be kidding.
No.
No, he deserves the credit. He made probably a political faux pas in stating it the way he did, but that was the reality. No, I wasn't angry at all.
Yeah.
He was probably angry that he said it.